Good afternoon, everyone who's joining this session about the guidelines for the development of gender responsive standards. I'm Stephanie Eynon. I'm the head of Standards Makers Engagement and Inclusion at BSI, and I will just say a very, very short few words and then introduce our fantastic speaker, Karin. This session is actually about guidelines that have been released to the technical community at both ISO and IEC. The reason why we thought it would be important to have someone talk you through the guidelines a little bit and explore this idea of gender responsive standards is because, of course, BSI, as hopefully those on the call who are standards makers already know, BSI is very much committed to equality, diversity, and inclusion in standards development and standards. And we very much see the gender responsive standards movement, if you'd like to call it that, as a great stepping stone in terms of inclusion in general in standards, with, of course, it addressing gender and women being 50% of the population. This is a great way to learn about how we need to do things differently to make standards that are not just gender responsive, but also more inclusive. So BSI has been involved with the wider gender responsive standards movement since the very beginning, and the creation of the UNECE declaration and so on. And it's a great opportunity for us to have Karin here, especially for those of our standards makers who are working on ISO and IEC committees, to learn more about these guidelines and also to enable us to then explore what we might put in place nationally for national committees. So I'm delighted to have with us here today Karin Lindmark, a friend and colleague. Karin is the Technical Policy and Standardization Services, head of, Technical Policy and Standardization Services at SIS, the Swedish Institute for Standards. And she's also co-convener of the ISO IEC Joint Strategic Advisory Group on Gender Responsive Standards, which is the group that developed the very guidelines which Karin is going to tell us about. And she's also involved with the gender responsive standards work taking place at CEN and CENELEC, as well as leading on gender equality at SIS. So Karin, thank you for being here. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Great to be here. I just want to explain to you why I have such a festive background, because Stephanie actually asked me when we entered the practice room, and it's because SIS, Swedish Institute for Standards, we're celebrating 100 years this year. So we've been having Christmas festive backgrounds throughout the year. So I'm not starting Christmas just to confirm. So I'm going to share some slides with you and walk you through, as Stephanie was saying, the guidelines we've developed. A gender responsive standard is something we all have been wondering what it is, but I will try to walk you through that today. I'm sure you've had a lot of interesting topics today, and it's always difficult to be the last one, but I do believe I'm talking about something that is key to our future success. For standards have been and should be not only tools for trade and cooperation, but also drivers of change. And if a standard is good and if a standard is reliable, it will be used by everyone. And as standard makers, we all believe that what we write will benefit all. But my question is, what if the standard is only useful to half of the population? What if the standard is only reliable if you are a man? That is really what gender responsive standards is all about. Standards that are relevant to all of us. But what are they and how can they be written? That's what I'm going to talk to you about today, I think. So I do have a question I would like to pop out that I think that I would like you to answer through, if you have time, throughout my presentation. And my question is, why do you think gender responsive standards are important? So if you could help me put that question out, so you can, throughout the presentation, you can your answer in there, and then Stephanie and I will look at it, and I'm sure there will be lots of great ideas. So what is a gender responsive standard? In my work with IEC and ISO, we have defined it as follows. So this is not a definition of sorts, but it's something we've held on to make it understandable for us. And according to us, a gender responsive standard is a standard that reflects an understanding of physical differences and gender roles, and equally addresses the needs for women and men. Like these two chess players here, the rules are clear and it works equally well for both of them. I can hear you thinking, well, why are there so many more male chess players than female players? Well, I do agree that that is the case, but I'm quite certain that that is not because of the rules, but rather because of the prejudices and the unofficial rules that surround the game. That too is something that I would, of course, like to do something about, or change, but that is not what I'm here to talk about today. As standardizers, we should make sure that the rules, like in this chess game, the standards to us work equally well for all of us. So again, a gender responsive standard is a standard that reflects an understanding of physical differences and gender roles, and equally addresses the needs of women and men. So what are your thoughts? Is gender considered in your work in standardization? A quick poll, yes or no? Oh, great. That is good news. 78% of you were lucky today, and I'm happy to agree with you that many standard makers do consider gender when writing standards. However, it's unfortunately not always the cause, and maybe the fact that you're actually here today is one of the reasons that you're aware of this subject. But I'm really happy that you wanted to listen to how we can get even better at this, because it is a challenge. So whatever, yes or no in this poll, the international standardization community are committed to take action on gender. Yeah, and Stephanie was saying earlier that ISO and I, talking about earlier on the UNECE declaration of gender responsive standards, and IEC and ISO signed it very early on, and they are committed to working and taking action on gender. So the gender action plan from their perspective, from the international perspective, is on representation in our community, in our committees, how inclusive our process is. Is it inclusive to everyone? The language we use, and then what I will focus on, the gender responsive standards. From my perspective, I've been involved in the last bullet, the gender responsive standards, and since early 2020, my focus has been that, because I was asked to create a joint strategic advisory group that was started back in 2020. I convened that together with a colleague of mine from Canada, and we work together with gender experts, standardizers, and people working in national standardization bodies. We have a mandate to develop tools for the technical community. During the first 2 years, we have, among other things, agreed on definitions and limitations. So that is to say, our scope, what we needed to work on. We also started out very early to do a survey, and that's, I mean, you did the quick question here, answering whether you took gender responsiveness into consideration when you write your standards. We did ask the full community that as well, and we realized that the awareness was very low, and we felt encouraged by that fact, because we saw the need for what we were trying to develop. And the third thing, or the thing that I will talk about today, is what we ended up doing, and what we published in September, is some guidelines that we hope will have help for you, for those of you who are actually writing standards or developing standards. Bling. I think the world has been very successful, and with the help of participants, as I was saying, from different backgrounds and with different expertise, we have had good discussions and lots of knowledge sharing. We have identified and worked on a number of challenges. Here are 3 of them on the slide here. The first one, we wanted to ask, who do we want to address? Key to our work was to build awareness. I've already mentioned that. And it was clear early in the project that we needed to address everyone, that this could not be a woman's work, nor a work of gender experts. We needed to reach the full audience, that is all our experts, and therefore we needed to explain that what we wanted to do was something that everyone can relate to and understand. Secondly, standardization is still, unfortunately, to a large extent, a man's world. However, we believe that diversity at the table is key to any change, even if we believe that. We also agreed that having more women around the table is not necessarily, does not necessarily mean that we will write gender responsive standards. So, not all women, I mean, having said that, not all women are, not all women want to be gender experts or gender champions. So in our work, we therefore decided to focus on what we need to do, not who needs to do it. And third, we did agree after that. I say this was long discussions, and Stephanie was part of them. We did agree that we needed to focus on gender in the binary sense. Not because we think that is the true answer, but we wanted to make sure that we must remember that even in some cultures, even male-female is a challenge to the concept of there being different sort of expectations. So we wanted to make sure that the full standardization world and all the cultures and the community that we embrace, that they could join us and want to understand what we were aiming at. But standards are for all, and that of course means that the broader sense of gender and diversity will come into play, but probably at a later stage. So we agreed that we started off with male and female. So now comes a second poll question here, which is, do you want guidance on gender responsive standards? So please, if I could have that poll, thank you. So again, I'm hoping that the audience here want the guidance, but I'm also quite sure that you might be the ones that do actually think, and since you answered the first poll, that you are aware and that you are thinking of it. You might not be the most needy ones, but I think it's important. So can we have a result, please? Oh, yes. I'm really, yes. Thank you very much. This was a risky poll, because if everyone had said no, I had nothing to speak about. So here we go. Mostly all of you said yes, and gladly I can then say that in September we did release a guidance, and that was done by the JSAG that I was part of. So that's the guidance that I will now walk through look at together with you. Oh yes, right, change. Oh, thank you. So here is what it looks like. It is, the guidance in itself is published both in IEC and ISO. It has been sent to all technical committees and all national standardization bodies. It is not mandatory, but it's highly recommended to all technical bodies within ISO and IEC. And we are in the process of communicating and working with all our colleagues throughout all over the world to make sure that this is available to everyone, so that everyone will have a chance to use it. But of course, I'm hoping in the long run that it will become mandatory. So the guidance document consists of 3 parts. The first part is the background, and the background explains a little bit of what I've been talking about why we need to do this, why it is important, where the idea originated from, and how we can make things happen within our standardization world. We have also tried to include a number of examples because I think the examples is a great way of making people understand why this is important. If you talk about gender responsive standards in general, it is hard to understand, well, what are they and why are they interesting to me? So we think that the examples is key to success. And then the last part of this guidance document is the checklist. So the checklist is also filled with sort of guidance and information on how to run through it, but it's also an exercise where you actually answer questions, yes or no, and there you will see you will get help on how to act and what to do when you decide to write or revise a standard. So what I will do now is not go through the full guidance document, but I will actually walk through the checklist and the 4 different areas that we think will be helpful for everyone if you walk through when you start revising or writing a standard. So please, Stephanie, if you change to the first. Next slide, yes. So what the first thing you do when writing or revising a standard is something that you always need to do. It's to consider or assess the diversity in the group. And this, of course, is something we've always done as long as we've been writing standards. I mean, we want to make sure that different types of organizations and different interests and different angles will be represented. We've usually been looking at, or are the producers there? Are the retailers there? Are the consumers there? Are the authorities there? You know, all the kinds of different organizations we have. But at this point, I'm saying that this should also reflect the different knowledges and the different backgrounds, and maybe even the different genders. So who is sitting around the table? Do these people around the table represent all the ideas we need to take into consideration? In general, consider that a group that are not thinking the same, or where everyone does not bring the same ideas and needs to the table. This is very important. So I've changed the quote to "Great minds do not think alike," because I think that's part of the idea that if you challenge each other, and in this sense with the gender questions, I think it will be a lot helpful. So that's the first thing you need to do when you start. And so this is the first bullet in the checklist. So this is what you're asked to do first. And then secondly, please, Stephanie, you change slides. So second, we are saying that you actually should assume that there are implications because of gender differences. This is one that we have been challenged on when saying so. It is a tough one. And how can you possibly assume that everything has a gender implication? Well, because you often hear people say, well, our products are gender neutral, someone might say, and they may be, but the users have different genders and they might have different needs. So even if the product itself is gender neutral, the ones that use the product is not gender neutral. Therefore, we think it's relevant to prove otherwise rather than just taking it for granted. So assume there are implications because of gender. Not only physical characteristics, such as the ones you usually, let me give you a few examples. For instance, if you talk about one thing that I've realized just a while ago, you know, these virtual reality goggles or masks, they are very often very big. I mean, they are not fit for any size of head. So that's one thing. Voice recognition is another thing that we're seeing now. Can they handle all voice types? You know, the soft voice, the high-pitched one, or the dark one? And then the classical example when it comes to physical characteristics is, of course, the personal protective equipment. That when in the beginning of times, the first standards that were written, they assumed that one size did fit all, and it was clear that it didn't, and especially if it was to work as a protective equipment. So these things have changed, and these standards are now very good, but it's an example of how the physical characteristics, you know, your strength, your size, makes a big difference in the standards you write. Having said that, those ones I think are, when you talk about examples, for instance, those ones are easy. But there are also socially constructed differences, like who is seen to be in control, who is expected to use this tool, who is expected to benefit from this service, for instance. So here are some other examples, like are the kitchens, for instance, are they built for the size of a woman? Because we expect a woman to be there more often than a man. So that's where a standard actually could be biased in the other direction than the one we normally talk about. Are the traffic systems configured by where and how a man drives? Usually a man might often drive to and from work, whereas a woman would probably do more short trips, like going to grocery shopping or leaving the kids at school. So there's, if we configure the systems or the standards that relate on those data or that information, then it might be that we're not actually showing the full need of the standard users. So wherever we turn, the standards are used by people, and people are not all alike. So that's the key thing here. And not to forget, when you talk about these socially constructed roles and expectations, that too is, of course, varies, though that too, of course, varies between countries and regions. So what we do know is that standards have users, and the users, again, are people, and people come in different shapes and sizes and have different expectations on their products. So that's why we need to assume that the implications are there because of gender differences. Yes, and then the third thing you need to do is, having decided how, if you've had these discussions in your groups and you're hopefully realizing, okay, we need to take other things into consideration, then the guidance will help you see what steps what the implications you've identified require. And depending, of course, on your product and on your standard and what you've written before, there might be significant action that you need to take, and or just some action. Or if you're lucky, your standard is really fit for purpose, and then you might only need a minimal action into the standard writing. So the guidance takes you through these different scenarios and also gives you ideas on what you can or should do. So it's really an idea that probably any standard would need some action or some change, but not all of them need a lot. So it's important that you go through this, even if you on the outset consider that, well, our standards are fit for purpose or gender responsive. And then the fourth thing we talk about in the guidance, that's the one that I think might be the most important, but also the most challenging one. So and it's about the data. So I'm expecting that you know that's what sex disaggregated data is. If not, it is data that is collected and then tabulated separately for women and men. So making sure that you know the data you're using. So here you should ask yourself, is there sufficient data? And if not, what data is missing and how can we find it? And often this data comes in forms of a shape of different statistics. Again, the example of a difference in daily transportation movement that I mentioned earlier between men and women. We do not have have the same driving or transportation patterns, but the data we see, if that is not disaggregated, we might be fooled thinking that everyone moves the same way. So this is where it's important to see, do we know if there is a difference between men and women? And then we talk about cars. We do have facts on car accidents. We do have statistics. We do have numbers, and we want to know if the crash test dummies we use are they really as efficient for all as we think. If we had sex disaggregated data for the traffic accidents, I've heard that there is indication that the car protection that is validated by these dummies, crash test dummies, does not work equally well for men and women. But we do not have the data, so we cannot prove our point. So this is something that when data is missing, we cannot just assume that, okay, well, the data we have, that it should work for everyone. We should actually challenge the data we have. And likely it's also the same fact for the end user. The data we use to understand the need of the different end users, is that disaggregated? Do we know if the end user, the man, or the end user, the woman, has the same use of the standard? Do we know if they actually, do the data we collect from the end users, is that disaggregated enough for us to make sure that the standards we write work equally for men and women? So data is challenging, but very important. And I know BSI has done a lot of work and there is a document where you can, and as well as this guideline, the idea is to help you challenge your data and make sure that you are aware of the data you're using. It's not easy to change the data we have, but raising awareness of this is important. So what's next? Those were the 4 main points in the checklist. And of course, the guidance itself has a lot more of information, but I just wanted to show you the 4 different sections that we've identified that we think that everyone needs to walk through. Having said that, the JSAG and the gender responsive work throughout the standardization community will continue. I mean, there is so much more to do. I think, for instance, that right now we're starting to look at training materials, because talks like this or informations on guidance on how to use data or just a checklist will be very valuable for many. So trainings, webinars, or even some sort of e-learning modules, we are hoping to develop that as well. Again, like I said in the beginning, I think the examples we share are so important, because not only do we learn from them, but they also prove our point. If we have examples of when it's been successful and when we have missed out on some of the gender responsiveness, I think the more examples we have, the better, because we will be raising the awareness of those not realizing how important this is. The third one, data and measurement, that is the challenge for the entire community. I mean, I think everyone that works on these issues realizes that we want to find methods and numbers to measure that we're actually moving somewhere. And we can send surveys and we can ask people how they feel about it and if they realize it's important. But how do we measure if a standard is really gender responsive? How do we actually find out that what we're doing, that, for instance, if we use this checklist, will the standard become better or more gender responsive? This is really, really challenging. So that is something we're also working on. And I think that's something that all these different groups are working on right now. And then again, I think that, of course, this is a continuous work of raising awareness. I'm really happy to see that there's such a large majority of you here that are aware of this, is the importance of this, are also working on it. But I think that speech like this one, and I'm hoping that what I've been saying will raise awareness, and we need to continue doing that. And all of us that are involved in these questions need to talk about them, because we need them. We need them to be on top of everyone's mind if we want to change. And we do, last but not least, bring in the men into the discussion, because unfortunately there's still this topic is still very dominated by females. Thank you.
Thanks, Karin. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can move to Q&A. And I'm happy for people to have their microphones turned on and videos turned on, if we can make that happen for those who wish to. Otherwise, please put questions either in using the Q&A function on Zoom. You can see it on the bottom of your screen, hopefully. Otherwise, click on the 3 dots and you'll see a Q&A option, or use the chat to ask your questions, whichever you prefer. I'll try to follow both of them and put questions to Karin. And if you have questions about what's happening here in the UK, you can ask those as well. But let's take advantage of Karin being here for any question. We have a comment in the chat. Karin, I think you saw that. Great session. It should be mandatory for all male content creators. Yes, well, as Karin mentioned, it's not mandatory for anyone yet in the ISO-IEC technical community. But as Karin said, that's one of the things we're trying to figure out, right?
Yeah, exactly. How to? I mean, we really want more people being aware, and as I said at the end, I think you pointed at something that very important, because again, in these groups that both Stephanie and myself are part, there is still a huge majority that are women, and of course we need the men to start talking about this as well. So indeed, I agree.
Yes. Well, and okay, so here's a question. You mentioned gender inclusive language. This isn't so hard in English, although it's harder than many think, Andrea, because there's a lot of words that are gendered and we don't realize it. But anyway, this isn't so hard in English, but some languages have a sex, or nouns and so on have a gender. Mm-hmm. How do you address that, where the language itself assigns gender to certain words?
That is a tricky question. Swedish in that sense is easy too, but like Stephanie was saying, we too have words that are very, very gender specific. We have discussions in the groups that I participate in with, for instance, French speaking, and I think they are struggling with this because it's not as if we could remove the gender sort of noun or the article as it is, but they're trying really hard to look at the language in a broader context, but it is a challenge. It is, yeah.
There is at IEC, I think it might be a joint group as well. There is the group that is specifically looking at inclusive language, a joint advisory group. Yeah. And I think there is still an opportunity for people to get involved with that. Mm-hmm. So if anyone here in the UK on this call today wants to get involved in the group that is specifically looking at inclusive language, drop us a note at standardsmakers@bsigroup.com, and we'll point you in the right direction. Yes, and so someone has suggested creating a list of gender neutral terms for guidance. I think that's one of the things that will happen through this advisory group, for sure. So another attendee has asked, anonymous attendee, are there plans to translate the JSAG guidance into languages other than English?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, I know that ISO and IEC are looking at both French and Spanish, but I can also inform you that in Sweden we've actually translated it into Swedish. Made some tweaks to it because of the type of language we would use in Sweden, but it's something very doable, and since it's not a gigantic document, it's also something that I have, when I talk to people that are not English speaking, I suggest. So I know that some of my Nordic colleagues are doing the same, because it is a document that is supposed to work equally well in any country. So then a translation would also work equally well. So I would encourage that for anyone who wants to do it.
And so what you're suggesting there is if other national standards bodies would like to translate the document, that is okay for them to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that ISO and IEC might be doing a translation into French and Spanish, hopefully.
Yeah.
Officially, mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So another question, it's interesting to see that 70% think their standards are gender responsive. I find that hard to believe, as many products and design is based on male data sets. How do you address this hidden bias? Yes, that was about your last point there about the data, isn't it, Karin?
Yeah. I think you're probably right. I am hoping that while the people who answered that the standards are gender responsive, I am hoping that would mean that they would be considering gender when writing gender responsiveness when writing the standard. I do agree that I think that it's very, unfortunately, quite rare that it is fully integrated in any standard, just because for the reasons you mentioned in the chat. So that is, I think that as long as we start addressing the issue, we will not be able to solve it tomorrow or not even next year. But if we take, and that's, I mean, it's the same kind of idea as why we started with the male and female version of or definition of gender. We want to start somewhere, making sure that we move this gigantic organization with the enormous amount of standards we have in the right direction, and hopefully we will start moving with people being aware and starting their change in the standards writing.
Yeah, and a great thing we've talked about in a couple of contexts here in the UK is the idea of just to be curious, to ask questions. So if someone says, for example, well, the data shows that, then you could ask a question, well, who was included in the data set? For whom does the data show that? And do we even know? So data, as Karin was mentioning, is hugely important, but knowledge in general. So if you think of data with a small d, not in the formal sense, all of the knowledge inputs going into the standards development process, it's important to really understand who they do and potentially do not represent. For whom is that knowledge actually true? And as Karin mentioned, we have to think about who might be using the standard, but also who is affected by the use of the standard. So, and will they get the same outcome? So it's important. A great tactic is to just start asking questions, really. And as Karin said, we are all BSI, ISO, IEC. You could say that we're at the start of this change, and what we're really hoping is that by starting with gender, we're hoping it's something that in most parts of the world they can get behind this, and that therefore we can use this as a way of learning how to be more broadly inclusive and bring more human difference into it. So we've got something in the chat here. So Tim has said, we do live in a world designed by men, but there's some great work underway, especially around city park planning development, to redress the balance, favoring the needs of women and children. Barcelona, for example, is making huge improvements which iron out the gender imbalance while also making the city more sustainable, driving down crime, increasing green space, and improving public health. Yeah, there are some great things happening. Yeah, but as Karin said as well, it's about how do we make it systemic? How do we enable it to happen every time, not just some of the time, right, Karin?
Yeah, exactly. And how do you talk about these examples in the context of them actually coming from the gender responsive perspective? Because I think it's very often it's easy that initiatives such as this in Barcelona, which is a great initiative, but it would become something on sustainability, and it is too. But I think it's important what I was mentioning about the key of having examples proving our point, making sure that why do they do this, and where does the data in this case come from? How have the authorities in Barcelona, for instance, worked to achieve this, and why did they come to this conclusion? So I think that's and it's a fantastic example. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Are there any other questions or comments anyone would like to share? We don't have to carry on until 5:30, which will be 5:30 for Karin. But I don't want to end early if people still have questions or comments they would like to share. Anyone? I can't see anything at the moment.
Yeah, there's something in the chat, Stephanie. A new thing in the chat.
Sorry, just popped up from Susie. If European standards that are written as part of a mandate and selected for harmonization have to be reviewed by an independent consultant, why not have gender assessed in the same way? Interesting. Karin, you might have more insight on that as an idea and its feasibility than I do.
I think I agree. It's a brilliant idea. The challenge here, as always, is the priority and the resources. I think there are. I mean, we are looking at a situation where there are so many needs we want to address in standards, because we know that standards are a great tool. We know that standards can be key in reaching net zero. It can be key in gender responsiveness. You know, all these things, and while I think that the consultants that are working on the harmonized standard, for instance, they are very focused on the technical aspects. But I think it's an idea that we could absolutely lift within the European context, at least, and see how we can sort of push in that direction. Because I think it's also difficult. I mean, we're asking experts in all the subjects that standardization covers, and they are not gender experts. I mean, they are experts in their field of work, and now we're asking them to put on a gender hat, which is not always easy. So we are also thinking of how can we support them. I mean, this guidance is a way of actually giving a tool to someone who is not a gender expert to start asking yourself the questions. But I think it's key that we in the future that we find experts that could either assess or coach the standard writers in doing what we want them to do.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think, you know, you mentioned participation as one of the things that people need to look at, the constitution of the committee and what knowledge and is or is not represented. And, you know, will they recognize the need for gender expertise? Will they have it? What additional support? So that's what the JSAG is going to be working on for our next period of time, isn't it? How can we support the technical community? What additional knowledge might we need to make available in the shape of human experts or in other forms of knowledge to support the technical community? Great question. Excellent. Anything else? Yeah, so you can have up-to-date data, which is disaggregated, yes. Although sometimes, depending upon the area, it might be hard to find the disaggregated data. But where it does exist, certainly we should be encouraging its use. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Excellent. Right. Well, if no one else has any questions or comments, I will say thank you very, very much to Karin for making the time to talk us through this today. And thank you, those of you who have participated. Thanks, Keith, for that nice comment. I assume that as this was circulated in September to those who are members of ISO and IEC committees, any of our committee members who are on the call today who are participating in ISO and IEC should have already received this. But we can make a copy available nationally to all committees as well if it's not already. It may be because of our being on BSI documents, which is iSolutions. So, but thank you very much, Karin. Great to see you as always, and thanks everyone for coming along.
Thank you everyone for joining. Keep up the good work and take care.